Did you know that if you took a time machine back 4,000 years to ancient Vietnam and grabbed a random person from the Red River Delta, their DNA would be almost identical to someone walking through modern Hanoi today? Despite 4 millennia of Chinese invasions, Mongol conquests, French colonization, and wars that reshaped the region, Vietnamese genetics have remained virtually unchanged. But wait, it starts to get weirder. That same ancient Vietnamese person's genes don't just belong to Vietnam, they'd show up in a Thai rice farmer, a Cambodian fisherman, and a Malaysian trader. Why? Because the Vietnamese didn't just survive at the crossroads of Asia, they became the genetic bridge that connected an entire continent. But surprisingly, in contrast to previous studies that suggested a largely indigenous origin for Vietnamese genetic diversity, we find that Vietnamese ethno-linguistic groups harbor multiple sources of genetic diversity that likely reflect different sources for the ancestry associated with each language family. The Vietnamese aren't just one people, they're a genetic melting pot that contains the DNA of at least 4 ancient populations. And here's the kicker. The Chinese invasions that supposedly sinicized Vietnam, they left a genetic trace, but not the one you'd expect. The French colonial period that lasted nearly a century, genetically invisible. The American War that defined modern Vietnam, it didn't change Vietnamese DNA at all. Today, we're unraveling one of Southeast Asia's most shocking genetic mysteries. How did the Vietnamese become a bridge between civilizations while maintaining their own unique identity? And why does Vietnamese DNA hold the key to understanding how all of Southeast Asia was populated? Picture this. It's 8,000 years ago. While most of the world is still figuring out agriculture, something extraordinary is happening in what we now call Vietnam. Southeast Asia is home to rich human genetic and linguistic diversity, but the details of past population movements in the region are not well known. Here, we report genome-wide ancient DNA data from 18 Southeast Asian individuals spanning from the Neolithic period through the Iron Age, 4,100 to 1,700 years ago. Vietnam sits at the crossroads of everything. To the north, you have China with its massive population explosions. To the west, you have the highlands of Southeast Asia. To the south, you have the maritime trading networks of Indonesia and Malaysia. And right in the middle, Vietnam becomes the genetic mixing bowl for all of these populations. Recent studies published in Science have revealed something scientists are calling the Vietnamese genetic convergence. We observe substantial genetic turnover between the Neolithic period and Bronze Age in Vietnam, likely reflecting a new influx of migrants from China. But here's where it gets crazy. This wasn't just one migration, it was wave after wave of different peoples, each leaving their genetic signature. Ancient DNA analysis shows that modern Vietnamese carry genetic signatures from at least 4 distinct ancient populations. Think of it like a genetic recipe that's been cooking for thousands of years, with each wave of migrants adding new ingredients to the mix. All Vietnamese carry Southeast Asian C haplotypes, which show a moderate geographic and ethnic stratification, with the Hmong constituting the most distinctive group. 2 new mtDNA clades, M7B1A1F1 and F1F1, point to historical gene flow between the Vietnamese and other neighboring countries. Fast forward to 6,000 years ago, Vietnam's genetic story begins with the Austroasiatic peoples, the original inhabitants who would become the foundation of Vietnamese identity. One hypothesis suggests that the forerunners of the ethnic kin descend from a subset of Proto-Austroasiatic people in southern China, either around Yunnan, Lingnan, or the Yangtze River, as well as mainland Southeast Asia. These weren't just random hunter-gatherers. The Austroasiatic peoples were revolutionary. They developed some of the world's earliest rice cultivation techniques, they created complex river valley civilizations, and they established the genetic template that would define not just Vietnam, but much of Southeast Asia. Here's where genetics gets fascinating. The Austroasiatic genetic signature is like a genetic fingerprint that shows up across an enormous geographic range. You can find it in Vietnam, Cambodia, parts of India, and even in some Chinese populations. It's as if these ancient peoples created a genetic highway that connected half of Asia. But Vietnam became the Austroasiatic heartland. Studies show that modern Vietnamese populations, particularly the Kin majority, retain strong Austroasiatic genetic signatures that have persisted for thousands of years. It's like they became the genetic guardians of an ancient civilization. The linguistic evidence backs this up perfectly. Vietnamese belongs to the Austroasiatic language family, which also includes Cambodian and Mon. But genetically, Vietnamese populations show the strongest and most consistent Austroasiatic ancestry profiles in the region. Now here's where the Vietnamese genetic story gets really wild. Around 3,000 years ago, something unprecedented happened. Chinese populations began expanding southward, and Vietnam was right in their path. Connections among Neolithic coastal groups from Siberia and Japan to Vietnam indicate that migration and gene flow played an important role in the prehistory of coastal Asia. But this wasn't your typical conquest story. The Chinese expansion into Vietnam was more like a genetic gradient than a replacement event. Studies of ancient genomes show that Chinese genetic signatures appear in Vietnamese populations, but they don't dominate. Instead, they blend with the existing Austroasiatic foundation to create something entirely new. It's like adding a new instrument to an orchestra. The music changes, but the fundamental harmony remains. The really fascinating part? This Chinese influence shows up differently in different parts of Vietnam. Northern Vietnamese populations show stronger Chinese genetic signatures, while southern populations retain more of the original Austroasiatic patterns. It's as if Vietnam became a genetic gradient from China to Southeast Asia. But here's the plot twist. The Chinese genetic influence in Vietnam isn't just from one period. We observe substantial genetic turnover between the Neolithic period and Bronze Age in Vietnam, likely reflecting a new influx of migrants from China. There were multiple waves of Chinese migration, each adding new genetic layers to the Vietnamese population. Here's something that will blow your mind. Vietnamese DNA contains genetic signatures from Maritime Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. How did island peoples end up in the mainland Vietnamese gene pool? The answer lies in one of history's most underappreciated migration stories, the Austronesian expansion. While the Austronesians are famous for colonizing the Pacific Islands, they also had a massive impact on mainland Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. Ancient DNA studies show that Vietnamese populations, particularly in the south, carry genetic markers that are characteristic of Austronesian peoples. These are the same genetic signatures you'd find in Indonesian or Malaysian populations. It's like finding pieces of island DNA in a mainland population. But how did this happen? The answer is trade. For thousands of years, Vietnamese coastal populations were connected to maritime trade networks that linked them to the Indonesian archipelago. These weren't just economic connections, they were genetic connections. Two new mtDNA clades point to historical gene flow between the Vietnamese and other neighboring countries. The genetic evidence shows that Vietnamese populations received genetic input from maritime Southeast Asia through both ancient migrations and ongoing trade connections. Let's talk about one of the most surprising non-stories in Vietnamese genetics, the Mongol invasions. Between 1257 and 1288, the Mongols invaded Vietnam 3 times. These were the same Mongols who had conquered China, devastated Russia, and created the largest contiguous empire in human history. Surely this would show up massively in Vietnamese DNA, right? Wrong. And the genetic evidence is shocking. The Mongol genetic signature in Vietnam is almost invisible. Studies of Vietnamese populations show that Central Asian and Mongolian genetic markers are extremely rare. It's like the genetic equivalent of a whisper in a thunderstorm. Here's what happened. The Mongol invasions were military campaigns, not population replacements. The Mongols came, they fought, they left. But they didn't settle in Vietnam in large numbers, and they didn't significantly mix with the local population. This tells us something crucial about Vietnamese genetics. Vietnam has a remarkable ability to absorb cultural influences while maintaining genetic continuity. Empires could conquer Vietnam, but they couldn't conquer Vietnamese DNA. Here's another shocking non-story: French colonial rule. From 1884 to 1954, France controlled Vietnam. Nearly 70 years of colonial rule, French settlers, mixed marriages, and cultural transformation. This should show up in Vietnamese genetics, right? Plot twist: European genetic signatures in Vietnam are practically non-existent. Overall, we find that isolation, coupled with limited contact involving some groups, has been the major factor influencing the genetic structure of Vietnamese populations, and that there is substantial genetic diversity that is not represented by the kin. The French colonial period was primarily administrative and economic, not demographic. French settlers were always a tiny minority, and most interactions were between Vietnamese and French officials rather than large-scale population mixing. This is completely different from other colonial situations. In places like Latin America or parts of Africa, European colonization left massive genetic signatures. In Vietnam, it's like the colonial period was genetically invisible. Here's where Vietnamese genetics gets really fascinating. Vietnam isn't just one people. Vietnam exhibits great cultural and linguistic diversity, yet the genetic history of Vietnamese populations remains poorly understood. Previous studies focused mostly on the majority king group, and thus, the genetic diversity of the many other groups has not yet been investigated. Vietnam is home to 54 officially recognized ethnic groups, and genetically, they're like a collection of time capsules, each preserving different aspects of Southeast Asian history. These ethno-linguistic groups speak languages that encompass the 5 major language families in MSEA. Our study shows extensive genetic diversity of the Vietnamese ethno-linguistic groups that is associated with heterogeneous ancestry-sharing profiles in each language family. The kin majority represents about 85% of Vietnam's population, but the other 53 groups tell incredible genetic stories. The Hmong populations in the north show connections to Chinese minorities. The Cham people in the south carry genetic signatures from Maritime Southeast Asia. The Highland groups preserve ancient Austroasiatic genetics in almost pure form. It's like Vietnam is a genetic museum where each ethnic group represents a different chapter in Southeast Asian prehistory. And here's the amazing part. These groups have maintained their genetic distinctiveness despite thousands of years of living in the same country. So what's the secret behind Vietnamese genetics? It's the most successful balancing act in human history. For 8,000 years, the Vietnamese have been the ultimate genetic diplomats. They've absorbed influences from China, Maritime, Southeast Asia, and the mainland highlands. But they've never been overwhelmed by any single source. They've created a genetic identity that's both deeply rooted and remarkably adaptable. The Vietnamese genome is like a genetic United Nations. It contains the DNA of ancient rice farmers, maritime traders, highland warriors, and Chinese settlers, all organized around a core Austroasiatic foundation that has persisted for millennia. Modern Vietnamese people are walking histories of Southeast Asia. Every cell in their body carries genetic memories of the world's first rice farmers, the builders of ancient temple civilizations, and the creators of maritime trading networks that connected continents. The next time you see someone of Vietnamese heritage, remember, you're looking at one of genetics' greatest success stories. They've maintained their identity not by avoiding change, but by embracing it. They've turned genetic diversity into genetic strength. That's not just impressive, it's the genetic equivalent of being fluent in multiple languages while keeping your own accent. And they've been doing it for 8,000 years. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.